Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The porridge was burning again. Elias Varro knew this the way he knew most unpleasant things in the morning, slowly, reluctantly, and only after the evidence had become impossible to ignore. The kitchen's ambient sensor gave its low, disapproving chime, a sound he had come to think of as the machine equivalent of a disappointed sigh, and he stared at the pot with the expression of a man who had performed this exact sequence of errors enough times that he could no longer claim surprise, only a kind of resigned kinship with failure. Saren did not look up from her tablet. She was standing at the counter in the gray-amber light that filtered through the habitat's polarized viewport, the particular flat, copper-edged glow of Duvina's long pseudodawn, which never quite managed to look like real morning and never quite managed not to. And she was reading something that was either genuinely interesting or performing the function of a shield, which with Saren was sometimes the same thing. She reached across without breaking her concentration, adjusted the heat setting on the burner panel with 2 fingers, and returned her hand to her tablet. The entire movement lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It had the quality of something so deeply habitual it had stopped being a decision, and become simply a feature of the morning, like gravity, like the recycled air hum of the station's ventilation, cycling through its first sequence of the day. Elias watched her the way he often did when she wasn't looking, not staring, cataloging, the particular tilt of her head when she was reading something that irritated her on a bureaucratic level, which was most things. The way the light caught the faint iridescence along the line of her jaw, barely visible, like the memory of color rather than color itself. She was tall, and still in the way that made her seem occasionally more like a painting of a person than the person, not cold, simply concentrated, as though she rationed movement and spent it carefully. Her irises, when she finally glanced up to check whether he had managed to destroy breakfast entirely, were their usual deep seawater color, which meant she was calm, which meant the morning was proceeding at a tolerable level of disaster. "You use too much water again," she said. "I use the same amount I always use." That is precisely the problem. He considered arguing. He had, at various points over the past 5 years, argued about the porridge ratio with the conviction of a man who believed that confidence and repetition could eventually substitute for accuracy. The results had been consistent. He served 2 bowls acceptable at the top, slightly geological at the bottom, and she accepted hers without comment, which was its own form of mercy. They had lived together in this 2-room habitat on Karath Station's residential ring, level 9, for 5 years. The station itself was a pressurized colonial outpost built into the equatorial ridge of Duvina, a tidally locked moon that received its light at an eternal low angle, and had apparently decided, architecturally speaking, that corridors should always be slightly narrower than comfortable. The habitat smelled of recycled air, and the dried herb bundles Saren kept on the windowsill, which she said reminded her of home, and which Elias privately thought smelled like something between pine resin and an apology. They had argued, at various intervals across 5 years, about the temperature setting. He ran warm. She ran cold. They had negotiated a settlement of 19 degrees that satisfied neither of them, and had therefore achieved a kind of diplomatic success. They had a system for the atmospheric recycler maintenance request. They both hated the system. The colonial maintenance portal required 17 authentication steps, and had once, during what Elias now referred to internally as the incident, logged him out mid-submission 4 times before he had said something to the screen that he was not proud of, and that Saren had found, based on her expression, genuinely impressive in its specificity. It was Tuesday. It was ordinary. The station hummed. The amber light moved. He had no reason, finishing his porridge in the particular comfortable silence that 5 years of shared mornings produces, the kind of silence that is not empty but furnished, full of the small known rhythms of another person, to think that anything in his life was other than exactly what it appeared to be. The drone arrived on a Thursday, which Elias would later think was the most Thursday thing that had ever happened to him. He was home early because Coordinator Fenwick had, in a rare and luminous act of administrative wisdom, canceled the tertiary water pipe rerouting committee meeting on the grounds that 31 people did not need to occupy a conference room to receive information that a memo could deliver more efficiently and with less collective suffering. Elias had read the cancellation notice twice, experienced a gratitude so pure it was almost spiritual, and left the Colonial Residential Authority offices 40 minutes ahead of schedule with the particular lightness of a man who has been unexpectedly pardoned. He was thinking about what to make for dinner when the door sensor chimed. The drone hovering at eye level in the corridor outside their habitat was not the standard Colonial Mail Service unit, which was a battered gray machine that moved with the energy of something that had given up on ambition and made peace with the decision. This was different. Matte black, frictionless-looking, bearing along its chassis the authentication seals of the compact's interspecies diplomatic channel rendered in 2 scripts, one of which Elias recognized and one of which he did not. It held a rigid ivory-white envelope extended toward him with the quiet mechanical certainty of something that had never once entertained the possibility of refusal. He took the envelope. He thanked the drone. The drone said nothing, because it was a drone, and departed with considerably more dignity than the Colonial Mail unit ever managed. Elias stood in the doorway and looked at the envelope. He could read Varese script passably. He had completed a basic language module in his 2nd year on Duvina, motivated partly by genuine interest and partly by the suspicion, correct, as it turned out, that Saren occasionally said things under her breath when the Colonial Maintenance Portal misbehaved that she did not intend for him to understand. The name on the front was hers. That much was familiar, but beneath it, in smaller formal text, ran a sequence of titles and designations that he read slowly, once, and then read again, because the first reading had produced a result that did not fit anywhere in the available categories of his understanding. He set the envelope on the kitchen counter. He looked at it for approximately 4 minutes, which was how long it took him to construct, and then cautiously dismantle 3 separate explanations, none of which were fully convincing, one of which was genuinely alarming, and one of which involved a clerical error of such spectacular magnitude that he almost preferred it on entertainment grounds. He made tea. The tea went cold. He left it and looked at the envelope. Saren came home at her usual time. She was carrying her bag over one shoulder and wearing the expression of a woman who had spent the day in moderate combat with an indexing system she found structurally offensive and had achieved neither decisive victory nor clean defeat. She said something about the Colonial Data Directorate's new archival classification protocol, which she described using a word in Varese that Elias had not encountered in his language module, and that he was relatively certain was not a neutral administrative term. Then she saw the envelope. She stopped. Not gradually, not the way a person slows when something catches their attention, all at once completely, as though the signal between intention and movement had simply been interrupted. Her bag strap stayed on her shoulder. Her hand stayed where it was. Only her eyes moved, and they moved to the envelope with the particular quality of recognition. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, the specific, unwilling acknowledgement of something you have been waiting for and hoping would not come. She crossed the kitchen and picked it up. She examined the authentication codes along the seal with an expression that Elias, who knew her face better than he knew most things he could name, did not recognize. It was not a new expression exactly. It was the removal of the one he knew, leaving something underneath that had always been there and that he had simply never been given reason to see. She opened it. She read it. Her irises shifted to a color he had no name for, not the gray-green of irritation he knew well, not the near violet that appeared when she laughed at something she hadn't expected to find funny. Something darker. Something that belonged to a depth he hadn't known was there. The station hummed around them. The dried herbs moved slightly on the windowsill. Outside, Duvana's light had begun its long copper shift toward evening, the same as any Thursday, unhurried and indifferent. Elias asked, with the careful tone of a man who had just felt the floor change texture beneath him, if she wanted to tell him what it said. Saren did not answer immediately. She was still holding the letter. Her hands were perfectly still. And somehow, he thought, watching her stand in their kitchen in the evening light, in the life they had built together out of burnt porridge and temperature disagreements and 17 authentication steps. Somehow that stillness was the most frightening thing he had ever seen from her. She told him her real name first, which he later decided was either the bravest or the most tactically sound place to begin, and which was, with Saren, quite possibly both. Thessavale Ro Iskarath. She said it the way you say something you have not said aloud in a very long time, carefully, with the slight hesitation of a person reacquainting themselves with a weight they had set down and almost forgotten the feel of. It sat between them in the kitchen, that name, taking up considerably more space than its syllables justified. Elias said nothing. He was engaged in the silent and demanding task of reorganizing 5 years of accumulated knowledge around a fact that did not fit any of the existing furniture. She was the third daughter of the Iskarath dynasty, which had governed the Varesi home system for 230 years. She said this in the voice she used for regulatory briefings, level, precise, stripped of inflection. And he recognized the technique because he had watched her use it during the quarterly zoning compliance calls when she wanted to deliver unpleasant information without giving anyone a visible surface to push against. She was doing it now for the same reason. The Reconstructionist Directorate had executed a coup 7 years ago, shifting the balance of the outer colonial systems in ways that the Compact's diplomatic summaries had described, at the time, as a regional governance transition, which was the kind of language that meant something terrible had happened, and no one with institutional authority wanted to be specific about it. Her family had been killed. She said it flatly. 2 words, a period, a silence after that he did not try to fill, because he recognized the quality of a door that had not been opened in a long time, and that she was not opening now so much as indicating its existence. He filed it. He would think about it later, when he was alone with it, when the full weight of what those 2 words meant for the person sitting across from him could land somewhere he was prepared to receive it. She had been extracted by a surviving member of the dynasty's intelligence service. There had been a new identity, a constructed history, a placement in the colonial network in a posting unremarkable enough to be functionally invisible. The infrastructure analyst position was real. She actually did the work, actually processed the atmospheric compliance data and the zoning allocation files, and the archival correspondence that she found structurally illogical and said so, regularly, to anyone who would listen, which Elias now considered either very committed cover or genuine professional feeling, and suspected, knowing her, was both. But it provided cover for intelligence work she would not detail. He did not ask her to. He was assembling a picture from the pieces she was giving him and trying to do it without letting his hands shake. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are an exiled princess being hunted by a coup government and you spent 5 years watching me burn the porridge." She looked at him. He said, "Every morning. You watched me do it every single morning and you corrected the heat setting and said nothing. And you had survived a coup and 6 years of deep intelligence cover. And the thing you chose not to intervene on was the porridge." She said with perfect composure, "It was your turn to make it." He laughed. He did not intend to laugh. It came out of him with the quality of something that had been under pressure and found a gap, not quite humor, not quite grief, something operating in the uncertain territory between them. He heard it happen and could not stop it, and did not, ultimately, try, because it felt like the only honest response available to him. She watched him with the careful attention of someone assessing structural integrity, moving through caution, and then something quieter, and then, at the very corner of her mouth, the thing he knew, the involuntary thing, the one she never quite managed to suppress when something caught her off guard in a way that pleased her against her intentions. He held on to that. The rest of it was harder. He asked about the intelligence work, and she told him she would not give him details and that he should not ask for them. And he accepted this with less grace than he would have liked, but more than he thought he was capable of, given the circumstances. He asked which parts of what she had told him about her past were true. She was quiet in the deliberate way she was quiet when she was choosing words rather than simply finding them. And then she said, "Everything I told you about what I prefer and what I can't tolerate and what I find funny is real. The geography I gave those things, the places, the people, the history, that was constructed." He asked if there was a difference. It was not a fair question. He was aware of this while he was asking it and asked it anyway, because fairness was something he would return to when he had finished being a man whose understanding of his own life had just been fundamentally revised, and he was not finished yet. She received the question without deflecting it, turned it over visibly, and said, "I asked myself that for 3 years before I stopped being able to answer it cleanly." Outside the viewport, Duvana's copper evening light had deepened into something closer to amberdark. The station's ventilation shifted into its night cycle with a low, settling hum. The atmospheric recycler, their atmospheric recycler, the one they had a system for, the one that had failed catastrophically at 3 in the morning 14 months ago, while she had stood in the dark kitchen directing a repair drone with the calm efficiency of someone who had handled considerably worse emergencies, clicked through its hourly calibration sequence. He thought about that night. The power fluctuation, the dark, the faint blue-green light from the tips of her fingers, which she found embarrassing and which he had called enchanting, and which had earned him 40 minutes of silence. He thought about what it meant to know someone. She was watching him with the expression he had not seen before tonight, the one beneath the one he knew, the unguarded one, the one that looked like a person waiting to find out what they were worth to someone and genuinely uncertain of the answer. He thought that uncertainty was the realest thing she had ever shown him. By Friday morning, the station knew something had happened. Not the truth of it, not yet, but the diplomatic drone had docked at level 9, and on Karath Station that was the kind of information that moved through the residential ring the way atmospheric particulates moved through the ventilation system. Silently, completely, into every available space. Elias knew this because Pieter from next door knocked at 7:40 under the stated pretext of borrowing a thermal coupling tool, which Elias knew for a fact Pieter owned in triplicate, and stood in the doorway conducting what could only be described as a visual survey of their habitat with the barely concealed methodology of a man who considered other people's circumstances a legitimate field of personal research. Elias told him they didn't have one. Pieter said, "Wasn't that something about the courier drone?" And Elias said yes, routine correspondence, and closed the door with the gentle firmness of a man who had spent 5 years on a colonial station and had developed, through prolonged exposure, a tolerance for social theater that he had never anticipated needing and now could not imagine living without. Saren was already gone. She had left before he woke, which she had done before, occasionally, over 5 years, in the way people who work early sometimes do, but which this morning carried a different weight. The weight of someone who knew how to leave without leaving evidence of disturbance, who had practiced absence. He stood in the kitchen and understood, in a way that settled quietly rather than struck, that she had been practicing a great many things for a very long time, and that some of them he had been watching without knowing what he was watching. She had left tea. Hot, correct strength, the right cup, the wide ceramic one he preferred in the morning, not the narrow one. He stood at the counter and drank it and thought about that. About the fact that a woman running an intelligence cover identity across 6 years of exile had still, this morning, made his tea correctly. He was not sure what to do with that. He decided to start by finishing the tea. She came back at midday. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, which they had argued about purchasing for 2 weeks before agreeing on it, and she told him the rest. The letter had contained confirmation that the Reconstructionist Directorate had tracked a surviving Iskarath line member to the colonial network. Not to Karath Station specifically, not yet, but close enough that close enough had become the operative phrase. The intelligence service that had placed her here had given her a window. She did not tell him how wide, and he did not ask, because some measurements you do not want made precise to make a decision. There were three options, which she laid out with the structured clarity of a woman who had already examined each of them from multiple angles and knew exactly which walls each one had. She could be relocated. New station, new identity, new life assembled from different fabrications over the bones of this one. She said this without inflection, but he had spent 5 years learning her silences, and he heard, inside the even tone, the thing it cost her to say it. She could apply for formal protected diplomatic status through the compact High Directorate, which would mean surfacing publicly, attaching her real name to a legal filing visible to anyone with compact network access, and becoming, immediately, a significantly more locatable person for anyone who wished her harm. She said this the way she said things she had already decided against, which was calmly and with a slight compression around the eyes. Or she could go back to Verzanath. She said this last one differently. She said it the way you say something you have been not saying for a long time, carrying it around in the interior pocket of yourself, neither deciding nor undeciding. There was a resistance movement. She said very little about it, and from the particular quality of that restraint, the careful, architectural kind, the kind that is load-bearing, he understood that it was more real and more dangerous than she was going to tell him, and that she was not telling him because she had already been protecting him for 5 years, and the habit was not something she could simply set down because the pretense around it had changed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to point out that the atmospheric recycler maintenance request is due today, and it is my turn and I intend to file it, and that the colonial maintenance portal will almost certainly log me out at least twice, and that I am going to need you to be within reasonable shouting distance when that happens because I cannot be responsible for what I say to the screen alone. She looked at him. He said, I'm not going anywhere. I said that the other night and I meant it and I still mean it, and I understand that what comes next is larger and more dangerous than anything I planned for when I agreed to the 19-degree temperature compromise. But I want to be clear that the compromise stands, and I reserve the right to renegotiate in the event of relocation to a warmer climate zone. Something moved across her face. He had seen her composed, and he had seen her quietly furious, and he had seen her twice, with the translucent second eyelid flickering in unguarded surprise, and he had seen her last night with the undefended expression of someone discovering what they are worth. What crossed her face now was different from all of those. It was the look of a person who had built a life out of not being known and had been known anyway, and did not know yet whether to be frightened by that or relieved, and was discovering, in real time, that it was both. She said, You do understand that I am not actually a mid-level infrastructure analyst. He said, You do understand that I have watched you spend 40 minutes arguing with a zoning compliance form on a Tuesday evening for personal reasons, so I am choosing to believe the infrastructure work is genuine and the other thing is supplementary. She said with enormous dignity, the zoning form was structurally incorrect. He said, I know. I read your written objection. It was 4 pages. The corner of her mouth did the thing. The involuntary thing. The one he had catalogued across 5 years, and that he now understood he had been allowed to see even when everything else was managed and maintained and carefully constructed, because some things are too habitual to perform and too real to hide. He filed the atmospheric recycler request that afternoon. The colonial maintenance portal logged him out twice. He said something to the screen on the second logout that Saren, from the other room, responded to with a short, sharp sound of genuine laughter. He submitted successfully on the 3rd attempt. He considered it a victory of moderate historic significance. That evening, They sat on opposite ends of the couch in the amber dark of Duvena's long pseudonight, the station humming its familiar low frequency around them, the ventilation cycling through its sequence, the herbs on the windowsill faintly present in the recycled air. She had her tablet. He had the documentary he had been attempting to interest her in for 3 months, which she had insisted twice she wanted to watch, and had fallen asleep through both times within 40 minutes, a fact he had chosen to interpret as comfort rather than indifference. She lasted 53 minutes before her breathing deepened, and her head settled against his shoulder with the specific weight of genuine sleep, not the managed kind, not the performed kind, the kind that only happens when a person feels, despite everything, safe. He did not move. Outside, Duvena's light was flat and copper-dark and permanent, locked in its long angle, illuminating nothing dramatically and everything honestly, the way ordinary light does. He thought about 5 years. He thought about what he had known and what he had not known and what he knew now, which was both more and less than he had believed, but which was, he was increasingly certain, closer to the truth. He thought about the name Thesavale Roe Iskarath, and the woman asleep on his shoulder who had burned nothing and fixed the porridge heat setting every morning without looking up from her tablet. And he thought that whatever came next, relocation, resistance, the slow and complicated machinery of justice grinding through